Clara Hastings had a habit of noticing things other people ignored. It wasn't something she talked about, and it wasn't something she tried to explain. It was just the way her mind worked. Patterns stood out to her. Small inconsistencies felt louder than obvious truths. She didn't rush conclusions, but once something felt wrong, she couldn't unsee it. That instinct had shaped her entire career. At 32, Clara had become known, quietly but firmly, as someone who didn't publish stories unless she was absolutely certain. She didn't chase attention. She chased accuracy. And because of that, the few stories she did release had a way of staying with people. But the story she was working on in the weeks before her disappearance was different. Even before anything happened, the people closest to her noticed a shift. It wasn't dramatic. Clara wasn't the type to panic or overreact. But there was a subtle tension in the way she spoke. She paused more often. She double-checked things she normally wouldn't. Conversations ended a little earlier than usual. Her editor noticed it first. Clara had been working on a land development case. On the surface, it was a routine investigation. A new commercial expansion just outside the city, backed by several investment groups. Everything about it appeared legitimate. The permits were approved. The funding was documented. The timeline made sense. But Clara didn't trust it. She couldn't explain why at first, only that something about the structure of the deal felt unnecessarily complex. Companies were layered over each other in ways that served no clear purpose. Ownership wasn't hidden, but it wasn't transparent either. It was the kind of arrangement that existed in a gray area, not illegal, but not entirely clean. 3 weeks into the investigation, she told her editor something that would later stand out more than anything else she said. It looks normal until you stop looking at it the normal way. At the time, it sounded like the beginning of a good article. In hindsight, it sounded like a warning. Clara lived alone in a quiet residential neighborhood where nothing disruptive ever seemed to happen. The houses were spaced just far enough apart to offer privacy, but close enough that neighbors noticed unusual patterns. Lights turning on too late, cars parked too long, doors left open. It was the kind of place where routine wasn't just common, it was expected. And Clara followed hers almost perfectly. She woke up early, worked late, and kept her evenings predictable. Most nights, she stayed in. Occasionally, she met a friend for coffee or dinner, but never anything that disrupted her schedule too much. That consistency is what made the changes noticeable. About 10 days before she disappeared, Clara mentioned something to her brother during one of their usual calls. Have you ever seen the same car more than once and started wondering if it's not a coincidence? Her brother laughed it off at first. What kind of car? I don't know. Dark. Nothing special. That's what makes it strange. Probably just someone who lives nearby. Yeah, she said. Probably. But she didn't sound convinced. Over the next few days, the small things began to add up. An unknown number called her phone more than once, always in the evening, never leaving a message. A man was seen sitting in a waiting area at her workplace without checking in or speaking to anyone. Her usual cafe routine shifted slightly. She began sitting in a different seat, one that gave her a clearer view of the entrance. None of these things were alarming on their own, but Clara noticed them, and once she did, she started writing them down. Not formally, not as part of her investigation. Just notes, observations, fragments of something she couldn't fully explain yet. The night she disappeared didn't begin any differently from the others. Clara returned home just after 8 p.m. A security camera from across the street captured her pulling into her driveway, stepping out of her car, and retrieving a small paper bag from the passenger seat. She walked to her front door, unlocked it, and went inside. There was nothing unusual about her movement, nothing that suggested she felt unsafe. Inside the house, everything followed its normal rhythm. The kitchen light turned on. Water ran briefly. A cabinet opened and closed. At some point, she placed her phone on the counter, then moved it again. That detail would only become clear later, when investigators reconstructed her movements based on subtle indicators inside the home. At 8:47 p.m., her phone received a call. The number wasn't saved. The call lasted 1 minute and 38 seconds. There was no recording of the conversation, but the timing would later become critical. Because after that call, everything changed. When investigators entered Clara's house the next morning, nothing immediately suggested violence. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. But the longer they remained inside, the clearer it became that something was wrong. Not because of what was present, but because of what wasn't. Her phone was missing. Her laptop was missing. But everything else remained exactly where it should have been. The kitchen told part of the story. Food had been prepared, but not finished. A pan rested on the stove, the burner turned off. A glass sat half-filled on the counter. It looked like she had been interrupted mid-action. Upstairs, the bedroom added another layer. A single earring lay on the floor near the bed. Not placed, not dropped in a way that made sense. Just there. The bed itself showed signs of use, but not disruption. One side slightly indented, the other untouched. The phone charger remained plugged into the wall, but the device it was meant for was gone. There were no clear signs of a struggle, but there were signs of movement. Subtle, displaced, interrupted. Investigators began building the timeline backward. The last confirmed sighting, the last known call, the last activity inside the house. Phone records revealed that the unknown number had contacted Clara multiple times over the previous 2 weeks. Not frequently, but consistently enough to suggest intention. The number was traced to a prepaid device, purchased in cash, used only for those calls. That detail changed the direction of the case, because it meant someone had planned this. Not necessarily the outcome, but the contact. The investigation expanded. Clara's work became the next focus. The land development project she had been investigating connected to multiple individuals. Some local, some not. One name appeared repeatedly in connection with subcontracting work tied to the project. Daniel Kessler. He wasn't a primary figure, not an executive, not an investor, but he was present. In small ways, consistent ways. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he didn't deny knowing Clara. He admitted they had spoken, said she had asked him questions related to the project. But when asked about the calls, he hesitated. Just briefly, but enough. Phone data eventually connected him to the prepaid number. Surveillance placed his vehicle in Clara's neighborhood the night she disappeared. And then came the detail that removed all doubt. A partial fingerprint recovered from inside Clara's home matched his. At that point, the investigation shifted from possibility to certainty. Daniel Kessler had been watching Clara. For how long? No one could say exactly, but long enough to understand her routine. Long enough to know when she would be alone. The call that night wasn't random. It was intentional. He told her he had information. Something related to the investigation. Something important enough to make her listen. And Clara did what she always did. She followed the lead. When she opened the door, she wasn't expecting danger. She was expecting answers. What happened next unfolded quickly. Not chaotic, not loud, but decisive. Control replaced conversation. And in that moment, Clara Hastings disappeared. Her body was found 11 days later in a wooded area outside the city. The cause of death confirmed what investigators already understood. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It was the result of someone who had crossed the line between observation and action. Daniel Kessler was convicted, but Clara's investigation remained unfinished. The connections she had started to uncover were never fully explored. The story she believed was bigger than it appeared, was never published. And that leaves one question that still lingers long after the case was closed. If Clara hadn't answered that call, would she still be here? Or would someone else have found another way to stop her?